think I have everything set up. Um, so I'm going to be showing you how to do working with layers inside of Capture 120. Some of the things I'll be talking about and demonstrating if you're not using a Wacom tablet will be a little different. I'm using, let me go ahead and share my, well, I won't share my screen yet. So everything that I'm going to be doing right now, I'm just going to try to tilt this over so you can see it for a second. I'm working on Cintiqs. So it's kind of like it's a Wacom tablet, but it's also my monitor. So I'm going to be drawing directly on my monitor with my Wacom pen. The only thing that's going to be changing is if you're doing it with a mouse, you won't have pen sensitivity to be able to do masking, which is mainly what layers are for. So let me go ahead and share my Capture One screen. Desktop 2. Actually, I can just do Capture One. I'm just resetting up my Zoom window so I can see the chat window if anybody is asking anything or whatnot. Okay, so everybody should be able to see my Capture One screen right now. And basically what I'm going to talk about is how to use, let me reposition my mic, how to use Capture One in a very similar workflow that you already use Photoshop in. In all the Photoshop classes, they've taught you how to build master files, which basically you're going in, you're doing your color correction, you're doing your global luminosity, your global color changes, and then you're going into doing your local adjustments. And following that layer structure works really, really well in Capture One because now that you can really get in and do a lot with layers and masking, you can basically have everything to where you can turn it on and off with your layers so that you don't have to go back and redo all of your settings from whatever part it is that you're doing on your file. So this works really, really well. We're going to start with this image here. This is not one of my images. This is an image from, I believe, a photographer named, he goes by RC Racer. And if you watch the Capture One YouTube channel, David Grover just did a quick piece on this image, and the next week he's going to do a full webinar specifically on this image and bringing it into something else. And I'm going to start by doing a quick crop because I like 16:9, and then I'm just going to get rid of this part in the lower section here that I just don't like. So once I do the crop, essentially, I wanted to work with this one mainly because I don't own a Fuji medium format. And this image was taken with the GFX 50R. And Capture One allows you to, they made a deal with Fuji that Fuji recreated their base characteristic curves for all their film types. So I can come in here and choose any of the Fuji film types. And I used to love and shoot Fujichrome Estia all the time. So I'm just going to choose that one as my base curve, just because I like the way that the overall look is. And I just wanted to play with that. So that's why we're working on this file. Once I have that done, the first thing I'm going to do is come in and do a white balance. The white balance I'm not going to do in an individual layer, but it's still going to be somewhat important. So I'm going to come in, and first I'm going to come down and do an add color readout. And I'm just going to start mousing over, and the sky is actually pretty neutral. And as I look at this 172, 172, 178, 171, 172, 178. So that tells me that I have a, well, about a 6-point blue cast in my image. that I'm going to want to neutralize. So I'm just going to come in, switch to my white balance tool and do white balance, and that does indeed clear out that color cast. And now I have 172, 172, 172 with a luma of 172. So now I don't need that anymore, so I can delete that. Oops. And from here, I have my background image, and normally this is the part where you would just come into your adjustments and start making adjustments. The downside to doing that is if you want to change your mind, you have to go back and look through everything and possibly re-change some of the other settings that you've done later down the road. So I like to come in and do layers for my entire workflow. So I'm going to kit a new filled layer. And a new filled layer means that anything that I do is going to be applied to the entire image. If I do an empty layer, it is going to basically be like in Photoshop with a black mask, and then I have to paint it in, which is kind of the exact opposite of what you would think if you're used to Photoshop. But for right now, I'm just going to new filled layer. Double click that. I'm going to call this global luminosity. And now I'm going to do my luminosity changes directly to this layer. So since this is going to be global, I'm just worrying about things that I want to apply to the entire image. And in this case, there's a bit of haze here in the foreground that I want to clean out. I need to brighten up the image a little bit. It needs a little bit of contrast as well. So I'm going to just do a little bit of an exposure pop, a little bit of a contrast pop. Tweak with the shadows, brighten the highlights just a touch. And I want to set my black point and white point. I can do that in a few ways. I could do it in levels, but the levels is going to be RGB, which means it's also going to affect color. Whereas if I come down to my curve, I can tap on Luma, and this is only going to affect my luminosity. And since I'm tweaking my global luminosity, it makes more sense to do that here than it does in the levels right now. So I'm just going to come in, bring in my point, and bring in my point, and this will give me more of the contrast between my shadows and highlights. I could bring it all the way into where it just starts to hit, but I actually don't want it quite that bright. So I'm just going to give it a little bit of leeway on each side. This obviously is subjective. And then if I wanted to add contrast, I could do that either up here with the contrast slider, increasing the contrast. Or I could come down here and the same thing applies, just do a gentle S curve, and that would also add my contrast. And I can toggle that on and off. And now my global changes for luminosity are entirely based in a layer, which gives me a lot of control later down the road. The next thing I want to do is come in, and the color is already relatively decent throughout the entire image. I want to boost the saturation a little. So I'm going to come in, add another filled layer, and title this one Global Color. And here I'm going to be targeting my RGB channels and my saturation. So I actually want to pop the saturation a bit, especially for the greens and up in here. So I'm going to do a little bit of global sat, come down here. Now in my RGB, I can come in and tweak, and this is going to affect Luma and color. And then I can actually go into my color palettes and really start to edit this a little bit. So I can come into my greens. I want to pop the greens a little bit. And I definitely want to pop the yellows. And the oranges. Up in this part right in here. So once I have that done, everything else is really going to be masking. And this is going to come down to me wanting to change a little bit here in the foreground, the rock, the sky a little bit, and applying those all in layers gives me a lot more control. And you can apply pretty much any setting in Capture One as a layer. So first I'm going to come in and do a mask to really pop this foreground. So I'm going to come in, add a new mask. It's going to be a filled layer mask. I'm going to call this forest. And if I want to see my mask, I can hit M and it will show me my mask. So the M key on the keyboard will toggle that back and forth. Now, if I really want to hit most of this foreground, I'm going to need to do what's called a Luma range mask. Rather than paint this in, since there's such a stark contrast between the highlights up here and the forest down here, I'm going to hit Luma. And what this dialog box does is it allows me to take my Luma range here and define the mask. So as I pull this down, you can see that it's controlling what's going to get hit. And I'm going to take this down until it hits right about there, because I want that branch of the, or that layer of the forest to be the deciding factor here. Now that's the top. That defines the actual range that this can occur in. And then the bottom down here is essentially a feather. So this allows us to feather the effect more or less. So I'm going to